What I want to do is to actually, as befits an academic setting, is not just to talk about the current politics, but to try to think a little bit about how we might think about the Hungarian case as it contributes to constitutional theory. And this is why I've actually started with this topic of the unconstitutional constitution. Now, I'm going to talk about the Hungarian constitution, but against the background of some sort of bigger constitutional theory arguments. And so, of course, you all know the new Hungarian constitution came into effect a few weeks ago. It has already been subject to a lot of international criticism, both with EU bodies. The EU's launched some infringement proceedings on the basis of some aspects of the new constitutional order, and the Venice Commission has now announced, the Venice Commission reviewed the constitution last summer, as most of you know, and now it's announced it's going to be reviewing 8 of the new cardinal laws in order to test their compliance with European law. So this is something that really has gotten a lot of European attention. I want to think about this question, though, of can a constitution, a whole constitution, be unconstitutional? So is Hungary's constitution liberal? Well, one of the dilemmas, and I think one of the challenges under this constitution, is that all of the key institutions and offices that the new constitutional order has created have been filled by members of one political party. And that's actually new in Hungary. Under the old constitutional system, there were a number of institutions in place that prevented any of the key checking institutions from being occupied solely by the members of one political party. I'll go through some of these later on in the talk, but just to give you one example, the media board was supposed to be divided between governing and opposition parties. Now, there were always all kinds of problems with filling those positions, but at least the understanding was that structurally that there could not be a monopoly. Or for constitutional judges, there was always a provision that any nominee to the Constitutional Court had to first get a majority of the political parties in the parliament before going on to get a 2/3 vote. And what that meant in practice was that any governing party that wanted to get its folks through had to give some folks to the opposition so that they could get through that first stage. So it meant that the institutions really weren't capturable. Under the new system, however, since almost anything can be done by a 2/3 vote, and since the current governing party has 2/3, it's meant, practically speaking, that the old multi-party guarantees are gone. It's also the case, and now we've got not just one but 3 different analyses of the new election law. There's the Hazai Haladas analysis, which came out first. Political Capital has just come out with an analysis. And Alan Renwick, who is an election law expert in the UK, has also looked over the election law too. And the election law that's come into effect leans very heavily toward one party, toward re-electing the current governing party, unless there's really such a sea change that hardly anyone votes for the current party, which is possible, but that's a kind of remote possibility. So essentially what you've seen is a kind of consolidation of power in one party, which is really new, I think, for the post-communist period in Hungary. What about checks on power? Well, to understand what the new constitution does, it's worth recalling what the old constitution did. And again, some of you who know this really well, I apologize, but for those of you new to the Hungarian system, it's important to understand that the old system actually built in a lot of checks on power. I mean, the most fundamental fact about the Hungarian political order is that it sets up a unicameral parliamentary system, which means that the prime minister is guaranteed to have a majority in the parliament, and that means that laws can be passed rather speedily, right? So the question is what slows down and checks that process? And under the old system, there were a series of bodies that did that. So first and probably most famously was the Constitutional Court, which had the power through this actio popularis jurisdiction to take petitions from anyone. By the way, it wasn't even just any citizen, right, but anyone could challenge a law for its constitutionality in Hungary. And the Constitutional Court was very active, particularly in the 90s, but it always stood there as a kind of check to be almost an upper house of a parliament, to look over most of the important legislation and to determine its constitutionality. So first of all, the Constitutional Court has really been reduced in its scope, scale, and ability to really check what the government is doing. So as I mentioned, there's a changed system for electing judges. Now, instead of requiring a majority of political parties, you just need a 2/3 vote of the parliament, which this government has. And they've already put onto the court 6 of their own judges with just the votes of one party, which is the first time that's happened, really, since the since the system change in 89, 90. They also expanded the number of judges from 11 to 15, so part of the reason why they got all those extra seats was because they gave themselves the extra seats to fill, and so now the court is 15. And again, it's 15 with 6 who have been appointed just in the last year and a half with votes of one party. The old Actio Popularis is gone, so no longer can people challenge laws in the abstract anymore. Now, the good part is that something called a constitutional complaint on the German model was added, so that now individuals who find themselves affected either by the unconstitutional application of a law or by an unconstitutional law can go to the court, and the court still has the power to nullify laws. But I must say that this is really a power that is much more narrowly construed. This turns the Hungarian Constitutional Court into something much more similar to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. model, of course, can do some things, but there are a great many constitutional questions that a court can't get that way. So questions about basic structures, competencies, fights among parts of the state, those are very hard to get to a constitutional court on that model. And I actually left out in the middle, of course, that this new constitution also removes the power of the Constitutional Court to review budget and tax laws, unless they infringe with a series of rights that are largely hard to infringe with budget and tax measures. The rights that it would be easy to infringe with budget and tax measures are actually not the ones on the list that the court can actually use to review those laws. So there's a whole vector of laws that the court can no longer review. So this is actually really a major change in the major check on how the Hungarian Constitution functions. Okay, what about protecting rights? Well, actually when I was here in the 90s, I used to think the rights jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court was the most important thing, and I still do. It's an amazing jurisprudence. But what you learn actually after watching a lot more constitutions in action is that you can't protect rights with a list of rights, and you can't protect rights just with one institution protecting them. And so if you don't have the guarantee of rotation of power, and if you don't have the guarantee of checks on state power where it's exercised, it's going to be hard in the end to also defend rights. Now, the Constitutional Court has this beefed-up capacity, and I really wish them luck at trying to do that. But there is a real danger when power is this concentrated for the enforcement of rights in the long haul. So is Hungary's constitution liberal? I don't think so. I think on all of these 3 points that I'd mentioned before about the multi-party republic, the checks on power, liberal rights, the new constitution doesn't meet those tests. So if the standard is a liberal constitution, and actually Catherine Dupre, whom some of you know, spent a lot of time in Budapest, is now working out these arguments in EU law. Is it possible for a national constitution to be unconstitutional against the background of EU law? Here I just want to make the political theory case that it's not a liberal constitution, so it's unconstitutional as a liberal constitution. I do think that when you look at what that old constitution embedded, it was literally this multi-party republic because of all of the checking multi-party features of that text. There was this repeated self-limiting power. This is really what's so impressive, I think, about the Hungarian constitutional process. When the socialist SDS government had 2/3, they put constitutional drafting at 4/5. When the MDF coalition had a majority, they put constitution making at 2/3. And there was this constant effort by the governments through the 90s to put fundamental change out of the reach of one electoral majority. And I think that's an important part of the Hungarian constitutional legacy. And I think the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court also really elaborated and filled in the rights protection, the powers of the government, and so forth. So I think these were the principles. And basically what I want to say is that if that was a general will, right, if that was a constituent power, then unless you call up a new one, you have to follow the principles of the old one, right? You could change the Constitution as long as you didn't, interrupt what are those basic fundamentals. A new Constitution would be fine. A cosmetic cleanup, which was certainly necessary for that Constitution, would have absolutely been unproblematic. But if you have a Constitution that comes in and violates those basic principles of what had been a multi-year consensual process, then I think the failure to have a new constituent power, together with the violation of the principles of the old one, create an argument for an unconstitutional constitution. I think it's really important for everyone here to begin to think about either what to make of this Constitution or what to make of a potential next Constitution. But I think it also tells us all that where Hungary is right now is not in the place that it really should be, because the principles of this Constitution are neither consistent with any liberal tradition, they're not internally coherent, they don't actually represent a constituent power, and I think even most importantly, Hungary itself can do better. Thank you.